Let's say you've got a question on Mrs Birling. Which quotes would be useful to get an idea about a character? Here's 5. The first one is in the opening stage directions. Sybil Birling is described as a rather cold woman and her husband's social superior. Keep in mind that in the opening stage directions, Priestley is trying to summarise the character for the actress playing Mrs Birling, so he picks out the key parts about her character in a few choice words. The audience would not hear this section. This quote comes in 2 parts. First, a rather cold woman. Zoom in on the connotations of cold and we get that she's not very loving. She lacks in affection for people, even her own family. Think of the connotations of a woman, loving, caring and maternal, and you get a juxtaposition, an oxymoron between the cold and the woman. This could foreshadow the strained relationship that she has with her children throughout the play. It must be quite lonely being so cold and not letting anyone get close to her. I mean, she even turns on her husband later on by saying it was all his fault for firing Eva Smith. The cold quote also foreshadows her callousness as she turns Eva away when she needed help. And she also point blank accepts zero responsibility for what happened, saying she only did her duty. Now, her husband's social superior tells us that she was of a higher class to Mr Birling and she married down. This might explain why Mr Birling is so into the idea of Gerald marrying down to Sheila. The same thing happened to him. Now, coming from an upper class family tells us that Mrs Birling has lived an upper class life her entire life. So she's had no experiences to give her a bit of perspective. She has all of the prejudices of the upper class in 1912. For example, that the working class are inferior to the upper. Now, you could say that Mrs Birling acts as a metaphor for the upper class in the society of 1912 Britain. So any of her attitudes reflect those of the upper class at the time, and she comes across as pretty judgmental, pretty snobbish, particularly to those who she sees as beneath her in this microcosm. In Act 2, she's talking about why Eva Smith may have killed herself, and she says, "Girls of that class," before she's interrupted by Sheila. Now, this could tell us that she's pretty prejudiced towards the working class, those who she sees as beneath her, which was the majority of the population at that time. The determiner, that, tells us that she sees the working class as completely different from herself, separate. It might also show that, whilst being prejudiced, she completely lacks empathy as well. She's basically admitting that there is no possible way that an upper class person could understand the thinking of a working class person. She sees people as different based purely on class, not what they have in common, for example, being a woman in the patriarchal 1912. And speaking of women, she refers to Eva as a girl instead of a woman or a lady. With the connotations of girl being immaturity and lacking sophistication and elegance, as she's more of a child than a full-grown woman, we see exactly what Mrs Birling thinks of Eva Smith: silly and irrelevant. One of the key themes that surrounds Mrs Birling is the theme of responsibility. She shifts the blame from herself to literally anyone else, even Eva herself. Here she says, "I'm very sorry, but I think she only had herself to blame." Now, she starts off with an apology, almost as if she knows what she's about to say is quite heartless, but she says it anyway. Perhaps as a member of the upper class, she feels like she needs to protect her reputation, hence the apology. She feels that she needs to come across as compassionate, especially as a member of the board for a charity. But it falls flat when she blames a pregnant girl with nowhere left to turn for her own death. As an audience, we don't buy her attempt to appear sympathetic here. And if you think about it, saying that Eva only had herself to blame is the exact opposite of Priestley's message about social responsibility. She was a victim of the Birling family, a victim of the class divide, a victim of the gender divide, and a victim of the harsh 1912 society. Here, Mrs Birling is victim blaming, and it turns the audience against her, if there were any members of the audience that were still on her side at this point. Mrs Birling then goes on to say, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. She says that Eva claimed she refused money from the father of the child because it was stolen. And by this quotation, she's essentially saying that it's impossible for the lower classes to have principles. She believes them to be immoral, unethical, and not holding the same values as her. Now, this is the reason, or one of the reasons, that she believes the lower classes to be beneath her. She even says as much when she says that it was one of the things that prejudiced her against Eva. She openly admits to being prejudiced against lower classes. Now, looking at it from a microcosm perspective, it could show that the lower classes have no way out, no escape from their poverty, as those who are in power, who hold all of the cards, are prejudiced towards them. And if we see Mrs Birling as a metaphor for the upper classes, Priestley is basically critiquing the prejudiced and arrogant opinions of the upper class, exposing them for his audiences, so that we can see the flaw in their way of thinking and ensure that we learn from the past and don't make the same mistakes as we rebuild the country post-World War II. And the final quotation I've picked for her is, "I blame the young man who was the father of the child. He shouldn't escape. He should be made an example of." The ellipsis just shows I've missed a bit of the quotation out. Now, I've picked this one for a few different reasons. Priestley ramps up the dramatic irony here. It's become pretty obvious to the audience and to Sheila that Eric is the father of Eva's baby. But Mrs Birling carries on blaming the father, talking of making examples of and public scandals. And Mrs B is the last one to clock on that it's actually her son that she's dropping in it. The fact that she knows her own son so poorly tells us she's quite a bad parent, going back to the rather cold woman quote from the stage directions. Her hypocrisy is also highlighted once she realises that the father is Eric, and she realises that she can't backtrack, but she indicates that she would if she could. We see the selfishness in her here as she indicates the reputation of the family is more important than anything, more so than justice. Mrs B also places the blame on someone other than herself here too. Now this juxtaposes with her own daughter Sheila. Sheila says that she accepts responsibility, she's ashamed of herself, and that she would never do anything like it again. This places Sheila as Mrs B's foil. We see how the younger generation acts, owning up to their faults and taking responsibility. We see the older generation blaming anyone but themselves, and for us, as the audience, we see who is the more admirable and who is the more cowardly of the two. And that's all for today's video. I hope that was useful. Subscribe for more English videos, and if there are any more of the quotations for Mrs Birling, drop them in the comments. Thanks for watching, and happy revising.